A concept that I think we can all understand is portals. Speeding thing goes in, speeding thing comes out. But now let's think about grandma. Do you think if you handed your grandma a controller and showed her this, she would know what to do? I don't think so. But I think if you showed her this, and this, and this, she might actually be able to make some progress. You see, a Valve designer mentioned that they specifically designed the section so that when the portal opens, the players can see themselves. This allows them to understand that what they're looking at here and what they're looking at here are the exact same thing. So that when they enter a portal, it's clear that they're entering the same space and not a different dimension. And it's reinforced by having players walk around the glass cube that they started in. It's not exactly mind-blowing to us, but to grandma, this is a big deal. Beginner-focused game design like this is found everywhere in Portal. And this lesson is just one of many that Valve slips into each and every chamber, so that skilled players and complete beginners can both enjoy this game. And that's why I want to showcase how every single chamber in Portal is full of these small details that enhance the player experience. And I've also identified 3 main design principles that make Portal's puzzle design so good. But before we get into that, we need to talk about boxes. Once the player leaves that first room, they're presented with their first real puzzle. Wow, crazy, look at that. But this basic puzzle is so that grandma can understand that boxes have physics, boxes can be interacted with, and that boxes go on buttons, and that boxes needs to continually stand on buttons for the door to open. 4 basic lessons, all in one puzzle. Another thing is that a puzzle's win condition should be clear. And so having the fizzler and the elevator at the end of each chamber allows the player to know that this chamber is complete and that they finished the puzzle. Oh, the other thing with fizzlers too is that it makes it so that Valve can ensure that puzzle elements don't go from one chamber to the other. That's the thing. This puzzle and the next 4 chambers are kind of a little bit mundane, but they're really important because they're the foundational learnings that new players need to have. And Valve layers basic lessons and then reaffirms them over time so that players can truly understand how to play. Kind of like a lab rat. I think Valve kind of has a trend of seeing players as like lab rats, basically. And all of the lessons I'm about to go over are going to be put to the test in Chamber 5. This chamber is split into 2 glass rooms with the exit in front. The rooms being made out of glass is intentional because a player can see both the cube and the button. And really, the entire point of this puzzle is just to reaffirm to players how the portals work and how the player can use them to solve puzzles. This chamber is a really great example of framing. When the player first enters, they're locked out of progressing until GLaDOS finishes talking. But because of framing, they're able to see the entirety of this room through this glass window, literally boxed in. But everything in this room is also kind of boxed in. The portal gun has literally arrows pointing towards it. This little window thing that shoots the portal through is in a box. Everything is designed to get the players to want to interact with this gun. Another great thing about framing is it allows players to see all of the important elements of the puzzle right from the start of the room. This pause can also kind of help impatient players realize that in a puzzle game, they might need to slow down and take in the sights to understand how to progress. Once the doors open, players need to actually enter a portal to pick up the gun, reaffirming how portals work, and then allowing players to only place one of the 2 potential portals. One thing Valve noticed is that some players thought that the blue portal was the entrance portal and that the orange portal was the exit portal. I don't know why they thought that because they entered through the orange portal, but that's why layering is so important because, not everyone's going to take in details right away. Anyway, this whole entire chamber is designed to address that by forcing players to enter an orange portal. Players can't, jump across this gap without entering the orange portal. This chamber is pretty simple. It just reassociates that boxes go on buttons. But it does also teach players that objects can go through portals and that their physics are affected by those portals. And that's why it's kind of designed for players to shoot a hole in the floor here and have it go through the wall. There's multiple ways to get it through the hole. So in my opinion, this is where the game starts really testing the players on their knowledge of the game's mechanics. And they do that with not 1, but 2 buttons. Which also means that there's naturally 2 boxes for the players to use. And like I said, this chamber tests the players on every single thing they've learned up until this point. They need to push the blocks through the portal to get it onto the button, and they'll need to enter the orange portal to retrieve the other box. Once the player solves the first part of this puzzle, they'll enter this glass chamber room, and this shows that players are affected by gravity through portals. Now early on, these puzzles are very simple, and there's basically only one way to solve them. But as the game progresses and Valve is more confident that players are able to understand the game's core mechanics, puzzles have multiple ways to kind of solve them. Sometimes it depends on the puzzle. This chamber introduces a new element, the energy ball. Ooh, whoa. They sort of serve as an alternative to the box, which rather than having a button and a box, you have a orb and a thingamajiggy, whatever this thing is. And this chamber is also, I think, really well designed because by the time the players reach the energy ball, they should have seen it bounce at least once, confirming that's how they work. And these energy things shine a convenient orange light above them, which hopefully will encourage the player to place a portal on the orange light. Pretty convenient, right? The other thing that this room introduces is black walls. This allows Valve designers in the future to get more creative with puzzle designs. Having limitations can actually create more interesting designs in puzzles, but it also works really well in this puzzle so that players aren't just throwing the energy ball all over the place. And once players power up whatever this is, the last new thing is introduced, moving platforms, which It's a moving platform. Crazy. This chamber is still about reaffirmation. This chamber just runs it back again. Redirect the energy ball to the thingamabob, power up the moving platform. But it adds one extra wrinkle by having players portal onto the ceiling onto the moving platform, just so that players can understand to not always jump into a portal right away. One interesting thing about this chamber is that it originally used to be chamber 6, but playtesters found it to be a bit too much. It makes sense because there's a lot of moving parts to this puzzle, and there's 3 steps really needed to solve this puzzle. Steps 2 and 3 are pretty simple. Energy ball onto the thingamabob, portal onto the moving platform. But step 1 requires juggling the energy ball and redirecting it so it can go from this direction to this direction. And that's really the importance of layering in this game. Without chambers 6 and 7, this chamber is just too many new elements introduced all at once. This room introduces fizzlers as a testing element, and Valve again uses framing to help guide players' attention. You see, if players are really stubborn, they can just throw the box through this hole up here, even if that's not the intended solution. But by now, Valve has been layering using portals as a way to progress, so having this box here, again, framing where to shoot the portal gun, and hopefully the majority of players will shoot a portal through the hole. The other thing that I really haven't talked about is how GLaDOS herself can be used as a testing element. Most of the time she serves as a narrative element that contributes to the atmosphere and world building of Portal. But in this chamber and several other chambers, I would really consider her to be part of the test itself. Her role here is to try and discourage the players. Kind of playing mind games.
The Enrichment Center regrets to inform you that this next test is impossible. Make no attempt to solve it.
Obviously, this puzzle has to have a solution, right? Your experience with this game will vary from others, but I wouldn't be surprised if some new players actually did get discouraged and would be worried that this puzzle didn't have a solution. And so then overcoming this puzzle becomes even more satisfying, even though the puzzle itself is pretty simple. And maybe that discouragement actually kind of explains why some people just desperately were shoving the box through the hole. I don't know. Sometimes playtesters struggled with the chamber so much that Valve has GLaDOS just give a hint to the players directly.
Momentum.
According to Valve, portal flinging was one of the hardest mechanics to teach to new players. So they give a lot of pretty obvious tips to get through even the thickest of skulls. The fling is communicated through players with kind of this diving board design, and there's even an image directly telling players what to do. Valve also uses this checkerboard pattern on the floor to help communicate to players that they need to fling here. But there's also one thing that Valve really struggle with, an innate desire that all players resist: looking up. Apparently during playtests, Valve really struggled to get players to just look up, which is a bit of a problem for this puzzle because looking up is required to solve it. So Valve's solution to this problem is to have the platforms move out so that players would see the movement in the corner of their vision and also hear the sounds of the platforms extending, which hopefully helps them look up. If you're looking at this and thinking it looks familiar, congratulations, your short-term memory is still functioning. This puzzle is a parallel to Chamber 2, and it's designed so that players have to traverse the entirety of the room before they can get to the portal gun. And keeping the portal gun in sight but just out of reach is a good way to build excitement to actually obtaining it. Now, we've covered how layering helps prepare players for more complex puzzles, but there is one drawback with doing that. Similar to Lab Rats and Cheese, players tend to associate one item with another thing. And in this puzzle, this button used to be a flat button that players had to stand on. But playtesters were so adamant about finding a box that they just ignored the solution altogether. Once Valve switched it to the stand-up button, it became a lot more understandable what players need to do. But I think Valve also goes the extra mile by adding a ticking sound so that players know that they need to actually act and portal through this door fast. It's little details like that that communicate to the player what to do, but still feel like they're solving the puzzle themselves. Imagine if a pop-up came up or your camera just panned over automatically, showing what to do. It wouldn't feel as good to solve the puzzle. Chamber 12 is another great example of how players sometimes don't pick up the information the first time. And so this puzzle is just designed to reaffirm how the fling mechanic works, and using the exact same design language they used in the previous chamber. Are you tired of chambers that are easy to solve? Fed up with boring chambers with just one button? Then do we have a chamber for you? This chamber has it all. Not only does it have 2 buttons, but it has energy beam redirection, moving platforms through, or jumping onto moving platforms through portals, moving platforms and portaling onto them from ceilings. Sounds like a lot? That's because it is. That's the benefit of layering. It helps players understand all of these elements in one chamber. Again, if you threw a new player in here, they would have no idea what to do. Layering knowledge by itself isn't good enough for these puzzles to be considered well designed. Valve needs to still design these puzzles so that players should know where to look and have fun solving. And that's why I think this box is another great example of how Valve designs puzzles and communicates that information to players. As you can see, the textures here kind of guide the player up. They change size as they get to the top of this little pillar thing. And sometimes these visual clues feel like they give away the puzzle. Like these doohickey things that shine the glowing light on the ceiling seems like it gives away the solution of where you're supposed to put the portal, right? Visual clues like that really help keep players on track with larger, more complex puzzles like this one. And now that we're onto these more complex chambers, it's time to talk about what makes these puzzles so good. So there are three main aspects to good puzzle design. If you watch Game Maker's Toolkit's video about puzzle design, these are going to sound a little familiar. But the first design principle is clarity, which is basically what I just talked about. The visual elements need to be clearly visible and are able to be understood by the player. Valve uses lighting to help make elements pop, and color is another huge aspect of this. White and black are the opposite of each other, as well as orange and blue. And that contrast makes it very apparent that these elements are distinct from each other. The second good design aspect is misdirection. If the player just breezes through puzzles, then the game just feels like it's too easy. So puzzles should make it feel like players have solved it, only for that to not be the case. This chamber is a really great example of that. They have all the pieces necessary to solve the puzzle, but the immediate answer requires a different solution. Which brings me to the third point, the aha moment, which is that breakthrough moment where players solve the puzzle, or at least solve one element of the puzzle and are able to progress. And if you balance these design principles correctly, you end up with a really great puzzle. And all three of these elements are featured really well in Chamber 15. This chamber introduces the double fling maneuver, so by the time the player reaches this point, they might feel like they have the single fling mechanic down, only to be completely wrong and hit this glass wall. Obviously, not all players have experienced that. Some players figured it out immediately, but I was one of them that didn't, so this was kind of the misdirection for me. Then the aha moment comes when players use the clarity of the checkerboard marker to understand that they need to fling again midair to go to the fizzler. And this design language is used multiple times in this chamber to help communicate what to do. This chamber introduces turrets, which I think is another great example of visual and audio clarity. When players enter the chamber, they can see that these turrets are firing at the player and that glass is bulletproof. And players know exactly what state the turret is in based on the dialogue and gun loading sounds the turrets make. I think these puzzles also start getting a little more creative with previous elements. Boxes here aren't just used to go on a button, they're used to knock over turrets and also help be a bullet shield. But Valve communicates that boxes have multiple purposes by having them sprawled all over the place. These are way too many boxes for this puzzle, but it just makes them feel expendable, so players aren't holding on to them like they probably would have if there's only one or two. This chamber is unique because it requires players to take one box and use it throughout the entirety of the chamber. They get the player over these stairs, block the energy beams, and of course, open the door. They also go into this glorified metal fire pit at the end of the chamber, which is great for narrative impact, but it also communicates to the player how these work because it's useful in the final boss. Lots of things in Valve games are dual purpose. It's great to fill these chambers with level design that functionally guides the player, but it still needs to be a great experience, and I think this chamber best exemplifies that feeling. Players start at the bottom, fling up some platforms, and face off against some turrets, and then fling themselves upwards again at the end. It's daunting to have to move upwards like that, but it feels exhilarating to overcome it. And players are basically using gravity against itself to proceed, which sort of foreshadows how players use GLaDOS' cores against yourself in the final fight. Might be a bit of a stretch, but I think it's kind of interesting. This final test is designed to get players thinking on their feet. But in many ways, it's a pretty simple puzzle. But that's by design, because cognitive function goes down when players need to think fast or when there's a time limit involved. However, even though the puzzle is simple, it still feels climactic to the player. That's something that Valve themselves notice, is that sometimes simpler can be better, but it's just how that simplicity is presented and how the chamber makes the player feel. And that urgency is communicated to players by having players portal through moving platforms and having to navigate around walls. And this wall right here is designed in such a way that the left side is cut off so that players know to portal around the wall. It's little telegraphs like that that make the level design of this game so good. And once the player reaches this part, it means that the guardrails are finally off. Escaping means thinking on your feet, which the game has now prepped players for. But there's a new challenge with these behind the scenes sections. The visual language of the game has functionally changed. And a lot of the telegraphs that players used to know are no longer the case. So Valve now has to reintroduce and reteach players this new visual language. And so Valve uses a different type of framing to help guide players where to go. For example, these pipes in the wall up here are bent in so that players know, hey, I can actually go this direction. And this room is designed so that players know which walls can have portals and which ones can't. I mean, it's still basically black and white, but you get the point. Valve wants to communicate to the player any changes that happens. These stairs and ladders fall apart, but their purpose is to get players to look up and realize that they need to move upwards to progress, which is a common problem that Valve had to design levels around. These back rooms are essentially about testing the player's navigational skills with portals. Portals are also placed in a lot more unconventional positions. And these pistons provide a great way to get a different vantage point. And players at one point are dropped into an old test chamber, but now the player can solve it in an incorrect way, which kind of further reinforces them breaking away from GLaDOS' control. These levels are designed around making the player feel something. as well as being great puzzles. And even now, these final areas are still introducing new elements and teaching the player how to play. These help associate pistons with movement so that when players reach this section, they can kind of know something feels a little off here. And this smaller ambush section helps prep players for the larger, more complicated one that they face later. And the same for this turret. It helps players guide how turrets work so that they know how to use it in the final boss. As should be obvious by this point, Portal is full of hidden tutorials that just feel like a natural part of the game. It does kind of make me wonder what is considered a good tutorial, because honestly, every game kind of needs to have one. Players need to know what the rules are so they can know how to win, right? And what makes Portal so great is that every gameplay change is preceded by essentially a tutorial. So even in this last chamber, the final dramatic boss of this game starts off with, you guessed it, maybe you didn't guess it, but I'm assuming you did, a tutorial. And I think this whole sequence in this room is really well designed because you can see the incinerator directly behind GLaDOS. And this puzzle revolves around having to open the incinerator with a button across on the left side of the room. In a lot of ways, you could kind of break this final sequence into 3 chambers layered together: the tutorial segment and the reaffirmation segments. The first segment introduces the gimmick relatively safely. Then the players are tested with a time limit and missiles, and portal flinging to be able to progress. Layering concepts is just brilliant because even though the final boss is basically a tutorial, it never feels like it. And that's why these games are so well beloved, because anyone can play them and succeed.
I have never played a computer game in my life, but I want to play this one.
Video complete.